Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy, where we explore the scriptural and theological case for plural marriage and now the historical case for Joseph's plural marriage. I am so excited to bring to you this second part of the series on the insurmountable problem of no children. I want to very sincerely thank Peter Brown for his willingness to sit down and talk about these things with me, for taking the time to put together the presentation that we are about to see, and for sharing his personal experience and his vast understanding and knowledge. These are such important topics that I hope people will listen to and take very seriously. We are responding directly to the exact claims and charges of some of the most vocal anti-Joseph accusers. And so they really have the responsibility to listen to these explanations, take them seriously, and find a way to respond adequately, which to this point they absolutely have not done. So I think that, anyway, I hope that people will share these videos far and wide so that those who really want to claim that Joseph was a polygamist will know what they're up against and what they have the obligation to respond to if they want to have any credibility or be taken seriously at all. So with that said, thank you so much for all of those who have supported me, for you that are here to join us. Again, I always hope that people will start and listen to the beginning episodes in this series to truly understand how opposed to all of Scripture and all of the Word of God polygamy always has been and always will be. And with all of that being said, thank you so much for joining us as we take this deep dive into the murky waters of Joseph's polygamy. Okay, I'm so excited that you are here for our second discussion, our second episode on the insurmountable problem of no children. And I am thankful to be here with Peter Brown, who has been working so hard on this polygamy question. Peter, how long have you been working on this? So I know you have a vast amount of knowledge.
Really, I've been involved with this discussion one way or another since 2015.
Oh, okay, so quite a while.
Yeah, 8 years.
Okay, specifically looking at things about Joseph Smith for that long.
Right. I mean, we've all, I read the comprehensive history of the church when I was 16 before I went on my mission, and so I was somewhat familiar with some of the polygamy arguments, but it just didn't really crop up in my life. It wasn't a big issue on my mission. Came home, went to BYU, and it just kind of disappeared. And it wasn't until I would say about a decade ago and a little bit earlier when I started getting involved with some blogs. If people remember the old Bloggernacle, and there was different podcasts out there. There weren't podcasts, there were forums like Times and Seasons, and I started doing some writing for Mormon Matters. And I didn't do a whole lot, but got involved with really researching different Mormon ideas, Mormon historical ideas. And that's where it really started flowering for me, was I would say 2010. And then polygamy itself really kind of came into the equation in 2015. I really wanted to understand and know what was all about this topic related to Joseph Smith, because it felt like that for the most part, all I was hearing was sixth grade answers.
Oh, that's a great way to describe it. Okay, I appreciate you giving that background. I know you're going to tell us a little bit more about your story as we go forward. I'm excited to talk to Peter today because he's done research specifically into some of the issues I introduced last week. Things like, Nauvoo polygamy in general, and comparing the polygamy of all the Nauvoo polygamists to Joseph Smith, and also some statistical analysis. Peter has some very useful and pertinent personal experience that really helps inform this discussion in ways that I think are profound and compelling, and that I want people to be able to hear. Peter, I have to thank you for being willing to do this. For those who don't know, Peter has a brand new baby boy that just got brought home from the NICU a couple of days ago. So he's snatching a little minute away from his new dad duties with everything that just a NICU baby is a different animal than a regular newborn. So thank you so much for taking your time. And I'm so happy that your baby is doing well, and just so happy for your story so far. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So far, so good.
Okay, well, is there anything else we should say as preliminaries, or should we just jump right in?
No, I think that's good. I mean, there'll be a moment where I can kind of share a little bit of my background and how this relates to the question at hand. But let's just go ahead and jump into it, and then we can I'll back up to some personal anecdotes that will help sort of the discussion.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, Peter has prepared a presentation. I think you're going to share your screen now, right? So he's going to share this with us. And as always, for everybody, if you have any questions or insights or thoughts or objections, anything to add, please feel free. It really helps to have the conversation continue in the messages. So, okay, we're ready.
Great. So in my mind, when people are debating about the different questions related to Joseph Smith's polygamy, typically, if you read through most of the LDS literature, it's a lot about the testimonial evidence. And that's sort of where I was backed up to, I would say, about 10 years ago. But then it came to my mind that there was probably the most important question to ask, and one that sort of gets avoided in these debates, is the lack of physical evidence for his polygamy. I was unaware. I was unaware of this point, I would say 2014, 2015. I assumed that Joseph was a polygamist. I assumed that he'd had children. I'd never heard the point that he didn't have any children. It wasn't something that was brought up, or if it was mentioned like in a book, because I'd read all the LDS books, Bushman's book. I was reading Quinn's book. None of that was ever mentioned. None of it was pointed out. It wasn't seen as some sort of like argument to show why, or one of the more the challenging points to the entire debate. It just was kind of glossed over or not mentioned at all.
Isn't that amazing? I find that amazing. I just that we just leave this side of it completely undiscussed. Can you, for anyone who is just wondering or not clear on what testimonial evidence is versus physical evidence, do you want to give us a quick definition?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking at all the people that came forward and said they were married to Joseph Smith, all the stories of all the wives, the stories from Brigham Young, I mean, going back to my seminary days, it was pretty much the William Clayton narrative. This is what happened. Okay. And Hiram, had to bring the revelation to Emma to convince her, and they ended up burning it in the fire. I mean, probably from the time I was in junior high, that story was burned into my mind, and that just was history to me. That's what I thought happened.
That's right. I think that's what's interesting. We are taught that factually without being given any insight into where the information comes from. Right. So all of the information we have about polygamy that shapes our narrative, what we're taught, comes from the testimonial evidence, which doesn't start until 1869. Joseph died in 1844. The testimonial evidence starts in 1869 and then continues for the next several decades, right? And then physical evidence would be things like, first of all, a child, but there's a lot more. It could be like a journal entry or a letter or anything from Joseph's day that we can track to Joseph rather than someone later on telling us their version of what happened decades later.
Right. And I think that most of us aren't aware of that. If you're, again, going back to that 6th grade or seminary answer, we're just taught that here's the story. It was given to us by William Clayton and a few of the wives. We just assumed that those stories were contemporaneous and recorded, and these people were trusted, that William Clayton is the boon companion of Joseph Smith, most trusted advisor. And so why would we have any reason to doubt his record or his testimony? And so right. that's where I'm sitting when I start upon this question. And again, I'll talk to everybody about where this sort of came to me once I get through these first few slides, because okay. I don't want to take away from that kind of aha moment. But let's just, at face value at this point, let's just say that the most important question to ask is, where are the kids? Where are the children? And in terms of doing this, I know this question's been asked before, but I wanted to look at issues related to fertility rates, DNA studies, and look at the years from 1842 to 1846. because that's when polygamy was being practiced in Nauvoo, with multiple different individuals, including the claims of Joseph Smith. So I wanted to narrow that down because that really paints a really interesting picture to help us scratch our heads and go, this story just doesn't add up. And so we'll go from there.
Okay, sounds great.
So I'm gonna just kind of walk through, if people aren't aware, and I know your audience is pretty educated about this, but for those that are watching it for the first time, we'll just state some historical kind of facts to just chew on. The historical analysis would say that Joseph had anywhere from 33 to 50 wives, depending on the sources. Most of those from 1833 to 1844 are the wives that are claimed. Most of those wives, however, we don't really see in the record until after his death. The successors claim that he first taught them polygamy in 1843, which, as I've gotten into this debate, I've realized that doesn't always add up, because Brigham Young, for example, has a polygamist wife in 1842. So, I know that you had a podcast a few weeks ago with Jeremy Hoop about this, how Brigham kind of changes his testimony depending on the audience. But again, back to my seminary sort of, 11th, 12th grade understanding, polygamy was taught to the apostles by Joseph Smith in 1843.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you get a little bit deeper into it, you find out, well, he might have known about it since 1831. And he really didn't teach about it publicly, but a revelation from him was produced in 1852 that commanded the principle of polygamy that was first allegedly recorded in 1843. That's something that I don't think most people going back to that 6th grade understanding really know. They're taught that this is a revelation from 1843. And
Right.
they're taught that as fact.
They also don't know that Section 101 that directly contradicted it was removed for the Doctrine and Covenants. They don't know that that wasn't added until 1876, when other sections that were that Joseph Smith did add during his lifetime were removed. So it is amazing how little we know.
Right. And so as I start reading up on some of these issues later on in life, and I've read Bushman's book, and I've read
Early Mormonism,
Tanner's book, and I read Quinn's book. I started reading Quinn's books so I could kind of get a more sort of well-rounded perspective related to Mormonism and Joseph Smith in general. It was very clear to me that there's a very wide historical consensus that he is the author of Mormon polygamy. And I didn't have any reason to doubt that. I believed it. It never really settled well with me, but I just kind of took it at face value for many years and just tried to find ways to dance around about the things that I didn't really like a whole lot about it. But again, I didn't know anything more than he married 30 women or married 33 women or married 40 women in Nauvoo to fulfill a commandment from God. And possibly that his wife didn't like it. Okay, that's all I knew. And I still consider myself a pretty astute scholar of Mormonism. Again, I'd read the comprehensive history of the church by the time I went on my mission. Most missionaries don't do that. But I still didn't know a whole lot about polygamy.
So what you're saying is, even reading all of the sources about Brigham Young, about Joseph Smith, the most scholarly sources, you were left with just a seminary level understanding of his polygamy. That's really interesting.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And but I found out, again, just about a decade ago, that there was this large sort of RLDS claim out there that goes back 100, 120, 130 years or more now. I would say probably more like 150, right? 1860, 1870. Yeah. That they believed that Joseph Smith was never polygamist. And this was the first time in my life I'd encountered the idea that Emma Smith, again, countering that William Clayton claim, Emma Smith claims publicly from her own lips that her husband was never a polygamist. and her son claimed that, and her brother-in-law claimed that. And that sort of like sent a ripple through me, because I was like, why haven't I ever heard of this? That always frustrates me, that those things aren't sort of put out in the historical record. Forget whether or not you think that they're true. If you're trying to present an honest case, you should at least present the evidence from all sides and walk through it and talk about how it can be difficult to conclude the truth, because there is still some controversy surrounding whether or not something was true or not true, because there's different conflicting testimonies. And,
Sure.
and let's not, I guess in my mind, Emma Smith isn't just one person versus, say, like 200 people that say that he was a polygamist. She's the wife of this man. And from my experience, most women who are scorned by a bad husband don't really feel all that motivated to necessarily come to his defense, especially A, after he's gone, B, she's remarried and she has a sensible life. She has no motivation to protect his reputation at this point, when she starts to talk about how he was faithful to her. She could have been truthful about it. Wouldn't have any sort of repercussions come back upon her, either in the community she was living in or in her new marital situation. So
It could have actually, she was living among people who hated Joseph Smith, and she could have maybe had more clout in society and fit in better if she had joined. Yeah, he was a bad guy, right?
Yeah, I found that out too later on, that a lot of the people in the RLDS church, even though they joined the RLDS church and supported the Smith leadership, they really didn't like Joseph Smith, and a lot of them was sort of like came from the William Locke.
I did. I was talking more about just the people in, like, living in her surroundings in Nauvoo. There was, they didn't want, they didn't start the RLDS church, and people came and asked Joseph III to take over, because it was well established in all of Mormonism that Joseph III was to be Joseph's successor, and they pushed against it, right? So if they disagreed with what Joseph was doing and they thought he was a bad guy, they had no reason to go join the RLDS church. And Joseph III did not benefit from it financially at all his entire life. He kept his father's debts. And anyway, that's what I think. You're right. I just want to add that Joseph III, as the 11 or 12-year-old son and the recognized successor, he was adamant that his father never practiced polygamy. And we have to claim that Joseph Smith, this polygamous leader, didn't groom his son, didn't train him up in the highest, holiest principle of the gospel of the church that he was destined to take over. And that an 11-year-old kid knows what's happening with their parents to a great extent. If there's parental discord or anything like that, that child knows. And Joseph III was always adamant that his parents had a good relationship. And I don't know why he would be motivated to lie, especially before he joined the RLDS. So, okay, sorry to interrupt.
I'm just pointing out that, a lot of the people that they ended up forming a church with, that a lot of those people like Austin Cowles, Isaac Sheen, Jason Briggs, these people all believed in the fallen prophet narrative. And that would have been easier on them if they just would have all gone along with that sort of narrative. But they didn't. They fought against it. They fought against it amongst their own people. They fought against it with the Utah Mormons. And so I find their testimonies very credible, because I don't see a lot of incentive for them. I mean, I guess there's this, we want to protect our father's reputation aspect. But in the terms of their society and the church that they were in and the church that they were leading, a lot of the people that stayed behind, a lot of people that didn't join up with Brigham Young, a lot of them didn't have the greatest feelings about Joseph's Nauvoo theology. In fact, to the point that when they formed the church, they basically kicked all the Nauvoo theology out and said, we're going to back up to Kirtland 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and that's where we're going to stick our line. That's where we're going to stick our stake in the ground, and we're going to live that theology, and we're going to either assume that Brigham invented everything in Nauvoo, or that Joseph went far afield, and we have to correct course and go back to when the church was true, which was 1835.
Yeah, that's useful for people to know that the RLDS church did not even follow with any kind of sealings. I think, did they even do baptisms for the dead? I don't know if they even accepted baptisms for the dead. I think it was just, so they rejected everything past that, because that's when things maybe started getting so messy. But anyway, and I know, just to tell, I know that there's a lot of, like, I wouldn't call Isaac Sheen, I don't think he continued in the fallen prophet narrative. I think there were some mistakes, there's a lot to study there, but your point is well taken, what you're saying. So
well, yeah, I mean, a lot of them kind of made peace with Joseph III, and so that helped. But I mean, even Jason Briggs, who was one of their apostles, basically it came to the point where he got excommunicated in the 1880s or 90s, I believe, because he refused to concede and decided to go his own way and gave up kind of Mormon ideas in general. But that was a big rift between a major leader of their church and the RLDS church. These are things that, again, you don't know about being somebody from Utah who's grown up in the LDS church. You don't understand, you don't know this other picture that's being painted from the other side of the Mississippi. And you also don't know how there was a real rivalry going on between the two sects at the time. We look back and go, well, we've won the war because you've got, 16 million Mormons, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. And the RLDS church, the Community of Christ Church, is I think 200,000 people at this point in time. And it's not really in a growth pattern. It's just sort of in a sustaining pattern. And so, we look at it and go,
actually, in a declining pattern. We'll find out in an upcoming episode. But the restoration branches, I hope, are growing.
Yeah.
Right.
And so we don't think we have to study their history, but going back to, I think, before the 1920s or 1930s, the membership numbers were fairly solid on each side, and it wasn't clear which group was going to sort of like win the sectarian battle between which brand of Mormonism was the right brand of Mormonism. So it's very interesting. And so going back into the polygamy thing, the number one argument that Joseph III would make, and that a lot of RLDS apologists would make, was that Joseph, his father, had no other children but those that were born to Emma Smith. He didn't have any brothers and sisters. He didn't have any kin that came from other mothers other than Emma. And that was a big point that they would point out and talk about for going on 50 years. And it didn't really change until the 20th century. And you talked about this, I think, last time, because then people came forward saying, hey, guess what? I'm Joseph Smith's kid. And that was all testimonial based, but people took it at face value. And then Fawn Brodie put it in her book and sort of like solved that puzzle. And people thought that argument had been sort of answered. So that's where it kind of sat for almost 100 years.
So again, if there are children, case closed. Joseph was a polygamist. And when Fawn Brodie wrote her book, she included all of the children. So the assumption was, well, case is closed now. Joseph was a polygamist because Fawn Brodie included all of these children. Again, factually. And again, like she just stated, factually.
And let's point out too, if people aren't aware, Fawn's book was the first real quasi-scholarly book to come out on Joseph Smith as a biography. And by today's standards, still a little bit, it's a little bit light on evidence and a lot on conjecture. But for the 1940s, it was groundbreaking and earth-shattering, because everything that had been written before that either came from a very super sort of polemic apologist standpoint from the LDS Church, or it was sort of a yellow journalist muckraking book. I mean, you can go back to Mormonism Unveiled, Pomeroy Tucker's book, Sarah Pratt's book. They're all basically like they're scandal novels, essentially.
Yeah. It just like started with John Bennett. John Bennett's book in 42 was the first of those, and they followed in that pattern. Yeah,
they're scandal novels.
Used him as their primary source.
They're written to sell books and to titillate Eastern readers and to sort of scandalize Mormonism. That was their whole intent. So now you have someone that comes along and tries to play neutral, so to speak, but still has an agenda. In fact, basically a lot of the pieces that she quotes, a lot of the references that she maintains and puts in her book in relation to this, she takes from those yellow journalist books, puts them in as a footnote, and all of a sudden it becomes a scholarly fact because she puts it in her book, and now people can quote her book, and they don't have to quote E.B. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled or Lee's book of the same title. Sorry, the Mountain Meadows guy. Also, I forgot his name.
Okay.
John D.
Lee. Yeah.
John D. Lee.
So
Yeah,
she served to give credibility to all of these previously not credible claims.
Correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
So now we've got this sort of scholarly consensus kind of brewing that he was a polygamist, and that has been that way really since the mid 20th century. But now you've got a problem, because what happened in the 2010s, and well, maybe I'll just back up a little bit and point out that the earliest church went through a schism in the 2000s, and a lot of it was over its modernization, and it changed, and it sort of said, well, yeah, Fawn Brodie sounds like, Fawn Brodie, and then Dick Howard, and then other scholars came forward from both sides of Mormonism and pretty much cemented in everybody's mind that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And the earliest church wanted to be seen as accepted to academia and accepted to sensible theological society. And so they decided to adopt I know there's no official sort of like take on it, but all of their apologists, all of their big time thinkers and scholars, their big historian is John Hamer, and he's firmly in this camp that Joseph was a polygamist, and Dick Howard as well. Both of them are their sort of apologist scholars, and they basically have pointed out it's settled science, it's settled history, and all of a sudden you have this schism in the church. And
Okay.
Richard and Pamela Price wrote the book Joseph Fought Polygamy in 2000. In a sense, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to, I think that the schism actually happened in the 80s. And it was actually, Joseph's polygamy wasn't a big part of that. It was about mainly if it was going to be conservative or extremely liberal, right? And if it was going to stay Mormon, or if it was going to go just fully ecumenical and become more,
Right.
like really disconnect itself from the Book of Mormon. And so interestingly, so I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. And then the Joseph Smith paper, the Dick Howard's paper, which did not in any way prove that Joseph was a polygamist. It was not that great. What it did, though, was say, hey, the RLDS historian thinks that Joseph was a polygamist.
Right.
That was the scandal. So like you said, and the thing I want to clarify also is that, so it's interesting because the LDS church claims that Joseph was a polygamist, but that God wanted him to, and it was from God, right? The RLDS church now doesn't take a stand, but those people you mentioned, Dick Howard, John Hamer, and the leaders, I think Veazey, say Joseph was a polygamist, but it's because he was a bad guy. They really have separated themselves.
He's flawed. He's a flawed man, a fallen prophet.
Right. If they believe, I don't even think they think he was a prophet now. I think that they just think he was, they're more in the Fawn Brodie camp somehow. It seems to me. I guess we could ask them. Well, and so now it's interesting.
A lot of them try to thread the needle. My wife and I did attend an RLDS church, or a Community of Christ church, when we lived in California occasionally. And the pastor of their church, they have pastors, hadn't even read the Book of Mormon, hadn't even studied the Book of Mormon. They don't even know about Mormon beliefs. They teach sort of a quasi-Unitarian Universalist theology.
Right.
We'll sort of focus on that. And so, so
thanks for letting me catch that up. So
really accelerated in the year 2000, because that's when they changed their name. They changed their name from the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the Community of Christ Church. And they really accelerated sort of that differentiation. And that's when the big schism happened. That's when you have the remnant RLDS church, some of the other offshoots in Missouri. Anybody who ever goes back to Missouri and drives around Independence, or just drives around Jackson County, Clay County, all the way up to Gallup, you'll see these you'll see sort of independent sort of RLDS churches that are propped up.
I think they call themselves I think they call themselves restoration branches. I just did a great interview
Yes.
on this that I'll release next week so that people can catch up on this. So yeah, that you'll see the Community of Christ or the Restoration Branch churches, right? Like,
And the reason I want to point this out, though, is because it was, in my opinion, it was the Price's book that basically went back to Joseph Smith III. They pulled all the old tracts, all the old arguments, and they rewrote it or updated it for a 21st century audience. And in doing so, it's sort of, a lot of people had exposure to these arguments for the first time. Again, Joseph actually preached publicly against polygamy. I never knew that. Joseph didn't have any children. I never knew that. And you started seeing it being picked up in, on the internet. And then you start seeing what they were doing was these DNA analysis. Ugo Perego was doing these DNA studies related to the claims of these children that Brody had written about. And again, people say, well, not all of them have been tested. I actually haven't looked into it to whether every single one have been tested, but enough have been tested that, if 8 of the 16 people who said they were Joseph's kids were tested and they've all come back as a negative, it sort of framed the idea that this testimonial evidence of these people that said they were Joseph's kids isn't reliable.
okay, and a couple of things to clarify on that as well. The very best cases have been tested, and we would have to do some research to get to every single claim, because I don't think most of them were the kid claiming it. Like, I'm Joseph's kid. I think someone was like, well, it could be, that could be one of the child. They're trying to speculate and find. But my understanding is that every best case scenario, the strongest claims to being Joseph's children have all been proven false. So
Right.
if we want to say, well, none of the best claims were, but maybe some of those already recognized, those really weak claims might be, like Von Brody claimed that there were children who were conceived a year or more after Joseph died. We don't need to do DNA on that to know.
Right, exactly.
Like, I think we can safely say Joseph did not have children with his polygamous wives. So,
Right.
okay.
And so just to kind of bring this home with this slide, I think a lot of people who are adopting this view that perhaps Joseph wasn't a polygamist are just responding to the science. I don't really know if there's a theology out there other than, there's some those RLDS breakoffs, but people in the Utah region, I don't know that it's in their best interest to adopt a viewpoint that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist. It certainly doesn't make them any more friendly with the LDS Church. And so I think that a lot of people initially, early on, were just following the science. That's how it was with me when I heard about Ugo Perego's work, and I had read what Joseph had actually done back in Nauvoo with preaching against polygamy, and the fact that there were no children. Things just started toppling over on my shelf in relation to this idea that he had to be a polygamist because of something that William Clayton wrote about Lucy Walker in his journal. It changed the dynamic for me, because this was science responding to something that was written down in a journal. And so that's where we're at on this. I feel like that initially a lot of efforts were just, this is us trying to follow the scientific arch. And if we can find a kid, I think that solves the question. But so far, we haven't been able to find a kid. So I think that the trajectory of where the science is taking us is in a direction that he was never a polygamist.
I completely agree with you. I think the point I've repeatedly made is that the more information we get, the stronger the case becomes that he was never a polygamist. If DNA evidence came about, it should be that we're discovering more and more children that we didn't even know about, right? If he had been a polygamist. Instead, DNA is doing the exact opposite. And the more sources we get, the more clear the picture becomes of the fraud that was perpetrated against him. So, okay, continue.
Okay, so now we're going to walk through some facts on this physical evidence, just to help us get a baseline here. Joseph and Emma Smith born 9 children, 5 to live to adulthood. I want to point out there's no fertility problems. Having child or infant mortality was a pretty typical problem in the early to mid 19th century. If your child doesn't live to adulthood, that's not problem of fertility, it's a problem of infant mortality. So claims
Okay, so
about him having a fertility problem, I think, fall short here.
okay, that's great. So you're talking about the claim that I played the clip of last week that Joseph didn't have strong swimmers that Lindsay Hansen Park made,
Right.
which I think is insane. So yes, I would like to see what information she has, if she has any. Exactly what you said. I actually found several studies that I'll link below just for anyone that needs them to show that infant mortality has nothing to do with fertility. They are not at all related. There is no connection between even chromosomal issues and fertility, or like you can't say that, oh, Joseph had these, well, really only 3 children died at birth, right? Don Carlos died, oh, I guess 4 children died at birth. You'll have to remind me. So they lost Alvin, their first baby, then they lost their twins, and twins are always high risk, right?
Right.
And so I think Alvin
Then they
from,
adopted twins, and one of those died.
right. But I'm only looking at their genetic children. So
Right.
Alvin, it sounds to me like, had a chromosomal issue, which happens, right? Does not have necessarily anything to do with Joseph. Then the twins, high risk, could have been premature, according to to Michael Quinn, who knows, right? And
Right.
then they lost Don Carlos to malaria at 1.5 years, which how they're trying to make that claim. And then they had one more stillborn. So that has nothing to do with Joseph's fertility or with Joseph's ability to give birth to live children. I think that's important to say. And I did look at the infant mortality rate in 1930, which is when they lost their first child in 28, and I think they're twins in 1830, if I can say it. It was about 45%, 448.
I thought it was 30%.
Nope, I just looked it up. I'll put this link below. Maybe my son could even put it in for us in the presentation. But from the stats that I found, in 1830, 448 children out of 1,000 died before the age of 5. And so actually, Emma and Joseph, to some extent, were beating those terrible odds because they had 5 live and 4 die, if I'm remembering correctly. So anyway, I just wanted to point out how ridiculous that claim is, and the fact that it was made, in my mind, shows how desperate they have become to find any way to explain this problem away. So, hey, continue.
Yeah, I just want to say, in this day and age, anybody I know who sires 9 children doesn't have fertility problems.
Exactly. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and there are no known children for Joseph with any of his other wives. My estimate is around 30 who are of the age of fertility, 10 of which have strong claims of conjugal relations. That's Brian Hales there, who makes those claims. Others make stronger claims, I believe. Talk about that in a minute. But so we do have wives that are fertile that had children after Joseph Smith died, and they remarried. And so it wasn't like they had fertility issues. So we got to find other reasons. Third, the most believing claim of paternity was dismissed by DNA testing. We talked about that already. But the other fact that was left out of the RFM podcast was that there are other men practicing polygamy in Nauvoo that had children with their polygamous wives between the years of 1844 and 1846, after Joseph died and before they went west to Utah. And we'll get into that a little bit later, because this was the key kind of evidence piece for me that flipped me completely, was this one.
Okay.
Right here. So the next slide. Let's go through these men. These are the men that had polygamous children. Brigham Young was married to 4 wives in Nauvoo: Lucy Decker in 42, Augusta Adams in 43, Harriet Cook in 43, Clarissa Decker in 44, all prior to Joseph's death. Now, he married 50 more after Joseph's death, the lion's share of those before he left in 46, by the way, not in Utah, which I find very, very odd and interesting, if it was such a scary place to be a polygamist and you're planning on that wait. Possibly one child born before 1844. And this is something I did some research on. I went and looked it up. So Augusta Adams had a child named Brigham that was born in 1838. and he died in 1843. And then there's another story about a baby who was born on her way emigrating from New England to Nauvoo in 1843, who died en route. And so I don't know if it's the same person.
Also named Brigham, right? That baby was
Yes,
also named
correct.
Brigham.
And I looked at that. That came from a family search research. In fact, just want to say most of this I did came from George A. Smith's piece in Dialogue on Mormon demographics. And then I was also doing primary research in Mormon, or in a family search, to see what people had listed in their ancestry. And full disclosure, I know it's not super scholarly, that there's some errors in there, but you know, for all intents and purposes for this argument, we can take it at face value, because it doesn't really change if I've got a date wrong here or there, or a child off here or there. It doesn't really matter to the end result of the discussion.
Right.
So
it also is the best information we have, and they usually will link whatever documentation there is. So we can,
like
using
a
family search, we still,
or a gravestone. In this case,
right.
38 was just a county in a city, and in New England, and that was it.
Right.
So there's more to look at there, because that could really change the narrative. We find that there was a Brigham Young Cobb. That Brigham Young Cobb that died in 1843 was 5 instead of a newborn. That would change the story just a little bit. He was a successful.
But what we do know that Augusta left her husband for Brigham,
Correct.
and came with him and had a child, or maybe 2 children, depending on this confusion, named Brigham.
Correct.
And so there is this confusion that, and both of them, or if it was just one, or if there were 2 sons named Brigham, they both died.
Correct.
And
The
so
whole
it is
point
very.
We have a possible child of polygamy prior to Joseph's death, which we don't have very many of. But those are just some facts we want to lay on the table here, because it's important to our discussion.
Okay.
He married 35 additional wives in Nauvoo. Many had also been allegedly married to Joseph Smith, which makes it kind of interesting.
Which, just to clarify, only according to later stories. There's no evidence for that. We know for a fact that Brigham was married to them in Nauvoo. We have plenty of evidence for that. We have none of Joseph's other than their testimonies.
In fact, what I've seen, if you're looking for primary or contemporaneous documentation of links to a marriage to Joseph Smith, the earliest source you can usually find are the temple records from 1846 Nauvoo, where, you know, a lot of times these men would stand in proxy and be married to somebody for time, and then they would say, well, I'm standing in place of Joseph Smith to be married to you for eternity. And you're going, wait a minute, weren't these women already sealed like 2 or 3 years ago?
Right.
So why are they being resealed again? So that's something that sort of, again, another domino falls. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. So unless you're trying to reframe the ordinance in a way that supports your new idea, that to me seems like the most logical choice as to why you would do that, is that you've got a whole new system you want to install. And so you need to reframe what had happened to you earlier as a marriage. So
okay.
Let's go.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and also just to clarify, I know we're hurrying, but they said they were sealed for time, and we've talked about what in the world does that mean, because sealing means eternal, past this life, right? So sealed for time, and then resealed to Joseph Smith. All of that is highly problematic, and that's the best evidence we have for Joseph's polygamy. So okay, continue on.
So this is man number 1. So Heber Kimball married first polygamous wife was Sarah Peak Noon, or Sarah Peak. I can't remember if it was in Sarah Peak Noon or Sarah Peak. Before Joseph Smith died, did that in 42. And I think you've talked about this before, but he bore a son, Adalbert, who died a year later in 1842. So, which is interesting, because here you have a child who died, infant mortality issue. We can find Heber Kimball's kid, but we can't find a child of Joseph that he might have had with a polygamist wife that had it, who died in infancy. So, I mean, obviously we can capture Heber's. So I don't know if we can't capture Joseph's. He married 14 wives when he was in Nauvoo.
I was thinking that Adelbert and Sarah Peak Noon were William Clayton's. Am I mixed up?
No,
Um,
it's Keeper Kimball.
okay.
William Clayton was Margaret Moon.
Okay.
Where I get confused, I think her name is Sarah Peak Noon. I get that mixed up with Margaret Moon and Ruth Moon, who were the wives of William Clayton. Sarah Peak Noon was
yes. Okay.
yeah. I think, and I don't know if Noon became. I can't remember. I just put Sarah Peak in there. I think that was her maiden name. He married 14 additional wives while living in Nauvoo, and bore 5 children before he left Illinois. And we talked about this before, that he might have had some possible affairs in England, recorded in his personal journal in 1840. You went through that with Jeremy.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to know this. Yeah. It's important, okay, for this whole discussion.
Okay.
Ward Richards, possibly, someone pointed out, I probably ought to like not be so certain on this. His so-called affair with Miranda Hyde. I don't know if you talked about the story where he kicked Ebenezer Robinson out of the Times and Seasons office and essentially took over as the editor. And there's a story of him like swooping Miranda Hyde into there to make it his love nest, and he runs out into the street and shoots off a gun in the street to celebrate his conquest. That's a late recollection from like the 1880s or 1890s. So let's just, if we're going to be fair to the other side, we say that a lot of the recollections about Joseph Smith's polygamy come late. I don't want to necessarily throw him under the bus on this, but there is this claim. For what it's worth, it's there. Put it into your understanding of this maybe a little bit. We do know that he did marry Sarah Longstreth and Susanna Lee in 1843, and then married 5 other women after 1844 while living in Nauvoo. He fathered 27 children with 14 of his wives, but none in Nauvoo. He's also witness to the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith.
And I know you're going to get to this, but I hope people are paying attention to the numbers. Each of these men, maybe Brigham a few more, but they have maybe 1 or 2 wives before Joseph died, right? And as soon as Joseph
died, boom, 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 boom.
Everything happens.
Yeah, I think September 1844 was when it really picked up. And I haven't done in this presentation to show the dates of when they married all of these women, but I have seen a scatter plot graph of that in other presentations where it's just kind of dribbles over time from 1842 to 1844, and then in September of 44 it just blooms and blossoms.
Okay, I'll see if I can find that. So so that's a good thing to pay attention to, because all of our excuses about Joseph Smith were based on the conditions in Nauvoo.
Correct.
They're still in Nauvoo in all of the same conditions.
In Nauvoo, under the same conditions, in some respects worse. They have a worse relationship with Governor Tom Ford.
They're being actively chased out. There's
basically they're negotiating an exodus. And so on one hand, I feel like that they've been given clemency from the state, but that wasn't it was a very loosely enforced, and there was a lot of problems with it. And the big issue in Nauvoo post 1844 was counterfeiting and bogus making, and those charges were being leveled against the apostles, and so they were under threats. So if something like polygamy was added on top of that, it would just exacerbate the situation. Next one is William Clayton. William Clayton married Margaret Moon on April 27th, 1843, again before the martyrdom. They had 1 child in February of 1844 that died 6 months later, and possibly one from an affair in England that you see floating around. Unsure about that, but at least be aware of that rumor. He then married Allison Jane Hardman in late 1844 and Diantha Farr in 1845, and 2 children born after 1844 before the move west. He was a key figure in recording Joseph's polygamy in Nauvoo, and again, possible affairs in England with Sarah Crooks, recorded in his journal in 1840. We talked about that in the episodes, but again, that's the picture of him as a polygamist. and
Okay, so this
the
is
demographics of William Clayton.
this one is essential because again, it is like you just said, it's William Clayton that all of the narrative of Joseph receiving 132 and Joseph's polygamy hangs on.
Right.
He is one who did have a child, perhaps two, during Joseph's lifetime, before Joseph's death, and
Absolutely.
then several right after. That is so critically important to know for everyone to recognize that William Clayton was a dedicated polygamist who fathered polygamous children before Joseph's death. Okay.
Absolutely. Um, Joseph Bates Noble, Nauvoo era polygamy, he is important because he's the one that, John Bennett said married Joseph to Louisa Beeman. He married Sarah Alley and Mary Ann Washburn in 1843. And then he is another one that bore a child, George Noble, February of 1844, and then bore another child in Nauvoo for heading west. So he's an important figure because, again, he's embroiled as somebody who stood in and married Joseph to other wives. My my thought or my theory is that the Louisa Beeman information that gets passed to John Bennett came from Joseph Bates Noble to Willard
Okay.
to John Bennett. But again, this is just a showcase that he was here's another polygamist that you see in Nauvoo who's very important. You see him on a lot of records related to Nauvoo polygamy and Joseph's polygamy.
Okay, so that is the possibility that I had tried to say this in my one episode that there could have been some people in league with John Bennett with this commonality they had of spiritual wifery / polygamy. And so Joseph Bates Noble, you're hypothesizing is that is a possibility right there.
Correct.
So,
Yes.
okay.
Yep. So now you have Thomas Bullock. Thomas Bullock is another scribe of Joseph Smith. There's a couple of wives that he records in his writings. I think he's the one that was the key figure to record that Joseph was sealed to Nancy Hyde, the same Nancy Hyde that allegedly Willard Richards took to his love den in the Times and Seasons office. He's the one that records that in a journal. He's also the one that I think he records some of the information related to Hiram's April 1844 speech, where he talks about wringing the noses of the men who are preaching polygamy, and he talks about his sealing situation with his dead wife and his living wife. And I remember I had an argument with somebody online about this, that I wonder if the recordings that he made were if there's any sort of
Fully accurate
representation on his part. And the retort was, well, he wasn't a polygamist in Nauvoo until after Joseph Smith died. Incorrect. He married
Yes, he was.
in 1843. He's a polygamist.
So let's tell that story really fast because it's so interesting. Some of my listeners will know about this. Hiram Smith gave an impassioned address on April 8th, 1844, correct?
Correct.
Where it's the strongest speech I've read against polygamy, even as recorded by Thomas Bullock.
Yes.
And
this is the
but
one missing in the Joseph Smith papers.
yes, that's what I was going to say. So to show how honest these people sometimes weren't, well, first of all, in the Thomas Bullock version, it's somewhat ambiguous whether Hiram, people could read into it either way, whether he was sealed to Mary Fielding. It's
Right.
very much most likely that he wasn't, right? Because
Right.
it had to be done later again and
Yeah,
several other reasons.
correct.
But
he got because she got sealed to Hiram by Heber Kimball as he stood.
right, posthumously.
Right, exactly.
Right. And there are other problems with it too that I won't go into. But what's so fascinating is William Clayton also recorded that entire conference, but omitted Hiram's speech. So he didn't even record it. We can still get, and then later on when they were preparing church history, they completely changed Hiram's speech to prepare it for church history before they decided even the changes weren't good enough. And they would omit it from the church history. So that speech has been changed multiple times. Even now, up until just a few months ago, Thomas Bullock's version, the original, has been removed from the Joseph Smith's papers. And all we can get are William Clayton's recordings of that conference and then the edited version of Thomas Bullock's speech that was prepared for the church history. And they were presenting those things as the original. So
Right.
to claim that Thomas Bullock, this polygamist in Nauvoo, might have altered that a little bit to fudge that Hiram could have been sealed to Mary Fielding, which is exactly the changes that continued on to happen, is completely plausible and is still happening to this day. It's fascinating. So this is a really interesting one. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. We have concluded that Mr. Thomas Bullock was a polygamist before Joseph Smith died, and could therefore be motivated to, let's say, fudge some things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
the next one is, where are we? Why won't it go forward? All right. Theodore Turley. This one's interesting. He's the first polygamist on record after Joseph Smith, before Brigham Young even, at least on record. And he is the one who married all sisters. He married Mary, Elizabeth, and Sarah Cliff. So he married Mary in 1842, and then he married Sarah and Eliza in 1844. This is an interesting story because this sort of runs counter to the narrative that William Clayton gave, where he told, I don't know, it was Flora. Was it Flora that he told? I can't
No,
remember
it was,
the
well,
story where he said
Lydia was the
Joseph said
third.
he told William Clayton that he couldn't marry three sisters, right? Just two.
Right. The story that we have is that he was married to Sarah and Margaret, and he wanted to marry Lydia, but Joseph said you can only marry two sisters, and then the claim is that Joseph wanted to marry Lydia. There is more information forthcoming on that, where actually we have evidence that Lydia spurned William Clayton and refused to get involved with him. And thus comes this story of Joseph saying, you can only have two to satisfy his ego. While anyway, and you're exactly right that Theodore Turley here has three sisters. So
Had three sisters. He bore a child in 1842. And then he fathered 8 additional children while in Nauvoo. So he's one of the more prolific child bearers of the Nauvoo era, which is funny because he's not really part of the cabal, so to speak. You don't see him involved with a lot of the scribal ins and outs, and he's not involved in the narrative of polygamy. So he's kind of someone I want to spend some time looking into to see what his role was when in all of this. He just seems to be kind of a quiet, unsung guy.
that's interesting. I
Yeah,
guess he was too busy fathering children to really be involved
exactly.
in all the shenanigans. Okay.
But I also recognize too, because they were all sisters, he might have been able to more easily hide his polygamy.
Yeah.
He was good.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then John Taylor, he kind of comes to it late in the game. He marries Elizabeth Kagan and Jane Ballantyne before the death of Joseph Smith. I mean, we're talking like December, February, I believe, of 1840, December of 43, and then February of 1844. And then he married 8 other women after 1844 while still living in Nauvoo and fathered 2 additional children before going west. And again, he was a
Okay.
witness to the murder of Joseph and Hiram and was wounded in the crossfire. So he's there where all this is going on. Anyway, just curious, a curious piece of information to think about. All right. So now we've gone through the gentlemen that were involved in polygamy during Nauvoo and their demographics. A little reality check. One of the things that we are constantly told in the church is that the followers of Joseph Smith essentially were just practicing and implementing his pattern that he established and told them in 1843. And so is that really true, or is that not true? And again, we walked through all the facts. We know that Joseph didn't have any children. All these other men did have children. Here is a summary of all of the children. Here's a summary of the Nauvoo era children, and then in green you've got children that were born before 1844. I need to include Theodore Turley in there because I didn't have that highlighted. He should also be in green. But you've got essentially
Okay.
5 people there that have children before 1844. Joseph has no children that we know of, and then you have all these other men who sired children in 44. 48 children born in Nauvoo.
Okay. So we need to break this down a little. Do you want me to go, or are you going to go?
Well, so this to me is this was my sort of my aha moment. This is where I flipped my belief, is when I came to recognize that there was this big of a difference between so this slide and the next slide, the differences between Joseph Smith and his successors. Joseph had no children, but his successors and followers bore many children after Joseph's death, and many before they even left Nauvoo. The different types of marriages that we have in the historical record, supposedly Joseph marries women that are already married, but in his successors and followers, they either married virgins or widows, or they got someone to divorce or leave their husbands and then come marry them. But the household,
Yeah, but they weren't polyandrous. Okay.
Correct.
It wasn't polyandrous. They weren't married to both men at the same time. All right.
Correct. Like in Joseph's situations, if he quote unquote married a woman who was already married, she didn't leave her husband.
Right.
For all intents and purposes, and most people don't dispute this, they were ceremonial. I mean, that's at least the Hale's point of view, that they were ceremonial in nature, but not so with his followers. With his followers, it was a trade-up system. So if you found a man who had hierarchies or somebody who would protect you better, you could leave your current husband and or go and marry the husband who had greater authority. Joseph Smith did not create households with his wives. You know, the only exception is he had a few quote unquote wives who lived as foster daughters and nannies, but that's disputed because they were his foster daughters and nannies. So were they living there?
He wasn't setting up a house.
Right.
Yeah, he wasn't setting up a household with them. Right. Okay.
Right. And but his followers created households with their wives. They were either separated and they just would move around, or they would move them into the same household. The same household thing didn't really largely happen until they got to the Utah period. So they basically had separated households. I know during the winter quarters era that was a little more fuzzy because of traveling overland. But the point is that every woman is kind of seen as she has her own domicile with her own children, and the man kind of goes around his route and visits each one of his households.
Okay.
This polygamy was seen in terms of fulfilling a spiritual commandment, even if he had sexual relations with it. The LDS Church's view is still that it was more of a spiritual fulfilling of doing something the Lord asked him to do, you know, whether it's a flaming sword or whether it's something that he prayed about and got a revelation on. He was trying to fulfill some sort of spiritual commandment. But Brigham and company look at polygamy in terms of a temporal commandment. They're raising up seed. They're spreading Israel through this sort of action. And so between the last slide and this one is where I came to believe that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist. And
yeah, can you go back to the last one for just a minute?
Yeah, we'll go back to the last one.
Okay, because the thing I also want to point out is that the earliest any of these men took additional wives was usually 43, maybe 42, and maybe some shenanigans in England, right? But they had maybe one other wife and maybe 1 year, and they fathered children. We claim that Joseph had over 10 years, or, you know, like really, if we want to do the 1833, if we want to claim Fanny Alger as a wife, which is universally done by those who accuse Joseph of polygamy, we have to go back at least to 1833-ish, right? And all of that time with 30 wives, not one or two, for a decade, and didn't father a single child. That is amazing. That's profoundly important to recognize.
Profoundly amazing. And when I came to understand this in 2015, it was right after I had read the Joseph Smith's monogamy paper that came out. To me, it was groundbreaking. It was earth-shattering. It was scholarly put together. And when I read through that, again, it was like, why don't I know about this stuff? Why isn't this presented in any historical context from either LDS historians or post LDS or non LDS or anti LDS historians? Why don't they talk about this? It just is completely absent from the historical record. And
Okay.
before I got to this, so I had been investigating polygamy to try to figure out what I believed about it, because 132 had never really sat well with me, even growing up. There were pieces of it that I sort of clung to, dealing with ceilings and how contracts need to be um, enforced by the law of heaven if they want to last into eternity. That all made sense. That was fine. That's what I was taught about what my marriage was, my ceiling essentially was. But as you get deeper into it, it gets icky. And so
Okay. Yeah.
I always struggled with it. And so put it on the shelf, but came to a point in 2015 that I couldn't do that any longer. I needed to decide what I really believed was true about the practice. And I came basically to um, the same conclusion you did in relation to whether it was good or not. And I concluded that it wasn't good. At least the Nauvoo version of it wasn't good. I was still, in terms of biblical polygamy, was I okay with Abraham having multiple wives or Jacob having multiple wives? Sure. That didn't bother me. That, I, in my mind now, I look at that as this was these were men that were living as products of their time, that similar to the fact that they were all shepherds and raised sheep
Sure.
and were nomadic. That's it.
It was a cultural practice, not a divine
Doing
command. Uh-huh.
doing the works of Abraham wasn't marrying multiple wives. Doing the works of Abraham was um, setting ties to Melchizedek,
Covenanting with God.
covenanting with God, and being willing to do everything that God asked him to do, and repenting and
Hmm.
being able to receive the blessings of the fathers, from Adam down to Noah. And he's able to get that because of his righteousness, not because he married a concubine, or Sarah said, "Go lay with my concubine so we can have seed." And so, and in my personal life, so that the individuals watching this are aware, my wife and I have struggled with fertility. We got married in 2007 and have been really struggling trying to have children. And so trying to understand the dynamics of polygamy and how polygamy would fit into that sort of a situation, the Abraham story was always a little bit sort of interesting to us, because we would go, well, is that something that we could do in our lives if we wanted to have children, if we can have children? So we would just sort of like flirt with the idea here and there. I remember that we started watching a Sister Wives program on TLC, and initially we were kind of curious and kind of wondering if that is something that would work out for us. If people are familiar with the show, Mary, the first wife of Cody Brown, she only had one child. She couldn't have any more. They had infertility problems, and so
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mary, in some respects, inherits this large family that she can mother other children and kind of get that satiation from being a mother. And there was a little bit of a draw to that. Now, if you watch the series now, pretty much it's a train wreck. Everybody's left Cody. It's ridiculous. But back in 2010 or 11, when the show first started, it was appealing. And so
Yeah.
we thought through it, but by 2015, I had come to conclude there was something wrong about the practice. There was something that just didn't feel right about it. And so I had to make a decision about what I believed. And I came to the idea that Nauvoo polygamy was wrong, it was bad. And that if Joseph was the author of it, then he was misguided and he was mistaken. And in fact, when I read D. Michael Quinn's book, Origins of Power, D. Michael Quinn's great because he just sort of writes books and throws all of the details out there. He doesn't really get into narrative too much. But if there is a narrative that he portrays in that book, it's that Joseph implements polygamy and then sort of regrets it and goes and confesses that to William Marks. And I glommed onto that. I'm like, yes, that makes sense to me, because because now I can believe maybe he made a mistake and then he repented of it and came back to the Lord. And it's very,
Okay.
and that maybe the Lord had to kill him because, because of this great mistake that he made. But that doesn't make Mormonism wrong or bad, or I can live with that, and I can make peace with that. So that's where I was, and I was completely happy with that. And then all this information comes out, and it completely provides a new perspective that I could look at that I couldn't even contemplate before because I didn't know the facts behind it.
Yeah, so interesting. And I shared that perspective. That was my last perspective too, was hearing the William Marks quote. That's a big one for, that makes it think like, okay, he got mixed up in it to some degree, but that's what I believed for a long time as well, until this kind of evidence. It wasn't these same bits. For me, it was studying Emma, her life, that convinced me, but this is profoundly convincing. I can see why this convinced you. I hope it has the same effect on other people as well.
Yeah, I mean, this chart here alone, it just speaks volumes, and I could sit and stare at it for an hour and go, it doesn't make
What
any.
in the world? Yeah.
Yeah, what in the world? There's one of these things is not like the other.
Right.
So anyway, so that's where we're at. We've talked about the differences. These are facts, by the way, things that we can dispute. Everybody can look at this and go, these are the differences between Joseph Smith's polygamy and Brigham Young's polygamy. So one of the questions that people, or one of the things that people will talk about and say, but we really don't know if we haven't captured all of the possible children of Joseph Smith. There might be children out there that we don't know about. And okay, that's plausible. But I started looking into this, and like you mentioned on the prior episode, Brian Hills is the one who points out that the incentive to find children of Joseph would have been immense. And anybody who knows anything about succession in the church, who knows that Brigham Young was looking for an heir to Joseph Smith to essentially lead the church that he would groom and then put forward, because the Smith brothers, the Smith sons from Missouri weren't, or Illinois at the time, weren't going to take up the reins. They would do anything to find an heir or proof that he was a polygamist, especially post 1870, when there was this huge fight between the two churches, and then all the legal issues related to the church's ownership of the doctrine that culminated
The
in
Temple Lot case.
the Temple Lot case. They would have loved to have been able to prove to Judge Phillips about some errors. And so it really, the incentive is pretty strong. So, we do have Fawn Brody's published list. But it was proved that the best cases were proved false, that they weren't offspring of Joseph. And including the most famous case of Josephine Lyons, which I remember when the
I do too.
first DNA discussions were had, and they were only looking at the male heirs of Joseph Smith, that people kept saying, well, we can't look at women yet. We don't have the technology to look at all of the daughters of Joseph Smith. And the most famous case is Josephine Lyons, because of her mother's deathbed confession that she was a daughter of Joseph Smith. And so people were holding on to that one, going, this is our smoking gun. This is the child that we can prove. And then when the case came out that she wasn't, it was like crickets for a while. Nobody could really reconcile that. That was something they had really glommed onto as one of their talking points. And it wasn't until just recently that I've seen how they basically said that sorry, I'm getting dried. Probably should get some water. That she's been, because she was having conjugal relationships with multiple men, Joseph and her husband, and that's
right.
She didn't know. Again, the historical record doesn't show that. Even among those that believe Joseph was having sex with his wives, it wasn't with the wives of other men. He wasn't doing that with his quote unquote polyandrous wives. That was with his younger wives.
It's been interesting to see how they both redid their narratives. Like I said, there are two different narratives, right? Because we're fighting on two fronts: the church narrative, the Brian Hales narrative, and then the anti-Joseph, anti-Mormon narrative. And the Brian Hales narrative, he had to, because he was very adamant. He was very sure that Josephine was Joseph's daughter, so that really threw him for a loop. And he rewrote his narrative to say that Joseph wasn't sleeping with any of the polyandrous wives, and that Sylvia, Josephine's mother, would have seen it as a eternal, as some sort of a spiritual, right? Like, she was a spiritual child. It's not spiritual wifery, but she was a spiritual child, right? So that's his new claim. And then the new claim of the anti-Joseph is that these women were sleeping with both husbands. I've even had, like I've mentioned before, Dan Vogel said, case closed. She didn't know who the father was. That is not what her confession was. That is not what she would want anyone to believe. So that's
Right.
completely speculative, and I think goes against the historical narrative. So, okay, continue.
Yeah, I think we can conclude with a reasonable assertion that it's unlikely we're going to find any offspring of Joseph Smith Jr. at this point. I think this. If you want to say there's a case closed, this is a case closed. We're not going to find Smith aside from maybe there's a new way to test some DNA, and one of the claims, especially of the daughters, that we can test. Maybe there's a method out there. Maybe there's a lost child that we're not aware of that we can find. I just don't see it happening. But I'm open.
I know, I kind of want to say, and maybe we will discover like a genie in a lamp. Anything is possible, right? It's what
Right.
is likely. And I would say that that's about as likely at this point as finding a genie in a lamp. And even Brian Hales admits it's not going to happen.
Correct.
It's not going to happen. Okay.
we-
We have eliminated all the best cases. So, okay.
Joseph's not going to have any kids. Okay, just not.
Right.
Emma. So there are some interesting points that people try to make as to why Joseph didn't have any children in his polygamous marriages, but everybody else did. So we're gonna walk through the rest of the presentation on these 8 points here, and so I'm just going to go over them briefly, and then we'll go into them in depth. So number one is legal issues. That's a big point that Joseph F. Smith would say, was that it was illegal. He didn't want to get in trouble with the law. Number two is his wife, Emma, didn't like the fact that he was marrying other wives, but she certainly was putting her foot down when it came to having other children, so she was going to keep that from happening. Three is that the wives were able to practice primitive birth control processes. You've talked about that before in your last podcast. We're not going to go over a whole lot, but that's one of the things they point out. Related to that is that Joseph employed the abortion tactics he learned from John C. Bennett. Again, this is kind of, I call this the far end of the speculative narrative here. Number five, you hear this one quite a bit. Just getting pregnant is hard.
Yeah, okay.
In general, it's hard. It's not the easiest thing to do under stressful circumstances. That fertility can just be challenging. And I can tell you, from our standpoint, it can be if you have infertility problems. But we're going to go through this because this is the stuff I've done a lot of research into because of my background and my experiences. So we can talk about that. Number six is Joseph didn't have any time. He was too busy trying to be the mayor and trying to be the general and trying to run a university and trying to run from the law and trying to run a church, that he didn't have the time to go around having these types of relationships, which again comes more from the apologist Mormon side of things. The anti-Mormon side is that's all he was doing.
Yeah, that was his whole motive.
He was catting around everywhere. Number seven is that Joseph had magic powers to only have children in the fall or spring. We'll kind of touch on that. That one's kind of fun. And then the last one we'll talk about is it's hard to get pregnant as a polygamist. There's a claim they have lower fertility. So we'll go through these, okay? So the first is legal issues waiting to go west. So the state of Illinois had an anti-bigamy law on the books that was $2,000 fine and I think 18 months in prison, was the if you got convicted of it, that was what you were looking at as far as punishment from the law. And again, during the temple lot ceremony, this is what Joseph F. Smith said, is that why didn't Joseph Smith have kids? Well, it was illegal. And well, the bigamy and polygamy was illegal, and a child was essentially evidence that there was a relationship going on. And so he just couldn't have children because that would have really compromised him legally, and he would have faced the challenges of an Illinois anti-bigamy suit. But let's also talk about what Joseph Smith was going through in terms of other legal issues and put that into comparison with an anti-bigamy charge. He was wanted for murder, or attempted murder in Missouri, was facing
for the governor.
Yeah, of the governor.
For the governor, that's a big deal.
Was facing extradition charges, and was there was attempts to kidnap him. One almost happened, where he actually did get kidnapped and then rescued. Someone had to make a movie on that. That one that's pretty fascinating. But so he's dealing with that. He's dealing with charges of counterfeit. He's dealing with issues related to bankruptcy. Until 1841, there were no bankruptcy laws on the books. And so people from Kirtland, people from New York were trying to place claim on Joseph as somebody who was in debt to them. And if you couldn't pay his debts back in those days, you went to debtor's prison. You were chased down by the law and put in prison for owing somebody money. So he's dealing with that. That changed a little bit later on with the laws that were passed in 1841 related to bankruptcy.
42. I'm actually going to do an episode going into that when I respond to the deeds and the lots, because that plays into it a lot. So yeah, people will get more information.
A lot of bankruptcy issues and trying to maximize the new law that had been passed, but also avoid getting caught from the old law. And then when it was rescinded in 43, then he was back to dealing with the same problems related to bankruptcy. So
yeah, it was complicated. Yeah, he had a lot of stress.
Right. Yeah, there was also charges of treason. There was the whole Council of 50 concern that he was trying to set up a theocracy.
Can I just point out also, this is what I find interesting, just really quickly. All of these charges, if you really do the research, stem from John Bennett. John Bennett is the one pushing to have him accused and charged and wanted for each of these things that we've gone through so far. And I find it fascinating that John Bennett was the real bigamist. Right? He was the one that had a wife and children that nobody knew about, and was pursuing bigamy. He was never, he wasn't afraid to pursue bigamy despite the law. And he's the one making sure these charges are coming. I just find that really interesting. If it weren't for John Bennett, Joseph wouldn't have had nearly so many legal problems, because John Bennett was the one making all of these accusations very aggressively. Okay.
Correct. And the other thing that was going on in Nauvoo is that when Joseph was booked or brought before a court or a judge, he was a liberal user of the habeas corpus term of the law, which basically, it's kind of like, we're not going to book you, we're not going to put you in prison, we're going to let you go. We'll wait till there's a trial before we decide whether or not we're going to imprison you or fine you or charge you. And then a lot of times by that time, the charges were dropped. A lot of anti-Mormons complained that he, overused this essentially to get away with things. Whether or not he did, the point is he was a liberal user of it and could have used he could have used this with anti-bigamy charges just like anything else. Whether it was true or not true, he could have used it. But the bottom line isn't, I think it wasn't until 1844, May or June of 1844, in relation to the expositor incident, there were no lawsuits brought up against Joseph for practicing bigamy. Nowhere.
Yeah, that he was never wanted for that in any way. The bigamy laws had all of these legal problems, nothing to do with polygamy. Okay.
All of the legal issues related to polygamy had to deal with slander. Either somebody complaining that Joseph slandered them for calling them a liar, for saying he was a polygamist, or the other way around. Joseph would sue somebody else for slandering him, for calling him a polygamist. So those were the lawsuits that were dealing with the Francis Higbee or Chauncey Higbee lawsuit in 42, and the the lawsuit that what's the guy's name that accused Hiram Smith of polygamy and
Oh,
40?
yeah.
That guy,
Yeah.
Spencer,
Yeah.
the one
I
that
can't remember,
the
but
one
yeah.
that asked him to get up in 1844 in April and give that speech was that lawsuit.
Right.
There's no
And the voice of
evidence.
innocence. Also, all of the other Nauvoo polygamists also had to deal with the bigamy law, and they had extra wives and they had children. So this was something that Joseph F. Smith later on had to dig up to apply to go, oh, this could have been the reason. There was no writing about them being worried about this law. There's zero evidence
Right.
of this law having anything to do with any of Joseph's or any of the other, or any of the polygamist
Right.
decisions. Okay.
My opinion is it was that Joseph F. was just speculating. That was his best answer.
Yeah.
I don't think he really knew.
Okay.
The kind of related idea is that he's going to wait to go west to do that. That's what he's going to do. He's not
Right.
going to have kids. He's going to marry all these women, and then when he goes west, then he'll start practicing openly or stop having abortions, whatever it is that he was going to stop.
Yeah.
He would stop doing that when he crossed the Mississippi. Okay.
Right.
We'll find out later why that's a challenge.
Okay.
Reason 2 is Emma Smith. That Emma somehow forbade him from having children because Joseph didn't want to risk her ire of siring children. But it was okay risking her ire to marry other women and some behind her back. And that was okay because an angel commanded him to do that, but not to raise up seed. So that to me doesn't
Right.
make sense at all, that she had some sort of like sway over him in that realm, but not in the marriage realm. Somehow the angel was like, all right, I get it. You can marry the women, but don't have any children with them.
And let's remember, in this entire discussion, there really is no birth control. So what you're saying is you can't marry, right? And the other thing is all of the sources that we have for the claims of Emma in any way being overseeing his polygamy, or objecting to his polygamy and being so angry and controlling and having him followed. Those are the same sources that tell us the story about her pushing the pregnant Eliza down the stairs, which
Correct.
we know is false. And so all of these stories have, again, zero evidence to back them up at all, except this later testimonial evidence, which so much of it we have already proven to be completely false, that there's no reason to believe this part of it when we know so much of it was false.
Telling you what she really experienced in Nauvoo versus William Clayton and Eliza Partridge, who by the time Eliza Partridge says this, she's Eliza Kimball or Eliza Young. I can't remember which one she married. That all blurs after a while. Anyway, you've got a Mrs. Eager Kimball and a Mrs. Brigham Young and a William Clayton going, Emma was pissed. And you're like,
they're telling us this story. Yeah. We ignore Joseph III, we ignore Emma herself, and we believe these other people. Yep. Okay. Who we know lied and lied and lied. Okay.
So one of the other pieces that somebody had pointed out on a forum was that Emma was in charge of their schedules and their ovulation records, and she was basically knew when they were having their period and would make sure that Joseph could go around and cat around in ways that would make sure that he didn't have any children.
I hope whoever said that will watch last week's episode. I wondered who would be running this ring of this fertility ring until, they would have had to do that after 1930. So, okay, that's helpful. Let's continue. The dumb claims are just
So then there's the
ridiculous
birth control claim, which you addressed last week. So we're not going to necessarily get into it. It was virtually non-existent or very dangerous in 1840. And we just don't have any evidence of that happening. We see a lot more dead women who were to apply poisons or dangerous implements to stop pregnancy from happening in 1840.
And I also want to say that while there were those dangerous methods, they were not had among like Puritan women. They were not had among the women who would have joined the church. They were had in brothels. They were had in houses of ill repute. So no, we don't have any evidence for any of this. Okay.
So there's the birth control. Reason for somewhat related was abortion. Again, you talked about this last time that Sarah Pratt said that Bennett carried around an implement where he could take care of Joseph's issues. So the only part I wanted to add to this is let's go through the timeline a little bit of John C. Bennett. Because I've done some research into this. John C. Bennett was already out of favor with Joseph Smith as early as February of 1841. This is when he sent George Miller to investigate claims that Bennett had left a wife and family in another state when he came to Illinois. And it's great that he, helped get the charter going, and it's great that he set up the university, and he did all these wonderful things for the Saints, which kind of ingratiated himself to Joseph Smith and put him in such a high standing. But by early 1841, he's already suspicious. So you have to have this image of Joseph and Bennett sort of walking around from 41 to 43 as two peas in a pod, because most of Joseph's wives took place what year? 43.
Well, 42 and 43, 43, and
late
Bennett was already
42.
kicked out.
Yeah, late 42,
Bennett-
early 43. He's already gone. He's toast. He's not around anywhere to be doing any of this stuff. So they go, well, he taught Willard Richards his practices, and while and okay, that's just, again, that's conjecture, but again, you have to ask yourself this question: why do we get 48 children born from 44 to 46 in Nauvoo, but not before June of 44? So was Willard Richards visiting Joseph and others and these terrible abortions, and then all of a sudden they decided not to in 44?
Right.
And so it just begs a lot of questions that will then take you up to that whole problem of what changed in the middle of 1844.
Exactly. Yep. And this is also people who haven't watched last week, go watch last week also, because there was no ability to do abortions by these men. Them being doctors did not mean they had any gynecological, obstetrical practice of any kind, or abortionist practice of any kind. So, okay.
And finally, just that, I mean, with all of the claims that get thrown about that people like you and me are conspiracy theorists, this is a conspiracy theory.
A massive one, that they were secret. Like, you have to think of the numbers of people who would know about these sick women, right? These damaged and dying women, and no one could tell. Yep. Okay.
Right. It's all based on conjecture. Okay.
Yep.
And then again, what birth control or abortion? Again, we're going back to the numbers of pre-1844 Nauvoo children born of polygamists, as well as those that were born after. We've got evidence of children. We've got evidence before and after of children. A few more before and then a ton after. Why wasn't it happening? Why wasn't it happening to these men? Why only Joseph Smith? If they claim to be his successors and his followers, why did he do it one way, but they did it a whole different way?
Right. Yeah, John Bennett should have been a really busy guy, way busier than he was.
Right.
And Clayton, yeah. I mean, Richards, okay.
And he would have had to sneak back into town because no one liked him and he was kicked out and excommunicated to do this stuff, and then sneak back out of town.
Yep.
All right. So again, it brings us to this fulcrum point of why were kids allowed post 1844? I mean, for me, this is the obvious answer. The obvious answer is that Joseph and Hiram were dead. And so the threats of excommunication and exposure to polygamy went down quite a bit. And so it was okay for people to start living more openly what they believed and start siring children.
Okay, I couldn't agree more. We have people being excommunicated for polygamy by Joseph and Hiram, right? I don't know that, like, after they were dead, people weren't excommunicated for polygamy. It was Joseph and Hiram that were the limiting factor. It wasn't the Illinois government that people were afraid of or were hiding from. It was Joseph and Hiram and Emma. Yeah. Okay.
That makes the most
I agree
sense.
Completely.
I mean,
It's the only thing that makes sense.
I'm open to other like really good answers, and I've actually put this out there to the wider community, but I haven't gotten good responses.
Okay.
That's the best response I've ever, well, I shouldn't say it's the best response. The only response I was given was it was Emma Smith.
That claim that she was overseeing the
No,
ovulation, or
sorry.
that she was keeping them on a leash?
Yeah, that Joseph, that Joseph was kept on a leash because of Emma, but all the other polygamists had willing and um, wives that were
Okay.
the wives that embraced their privilege. So that's why they had
Okay.
children, but Joseph didn't because she didn't embrace her privilege. That's what I'm.
Again, so funny that we claim that she could control him, and yet we claim that he had 33 wives, right? And I love that you have a Hiram's picture there as well, because there's no controversy about Hiram having no other children. And if he were Joseph's number two guy in this polygamist church, he would also have many wives and many children. So,
Right,
okay,
Joseph had
great.
30. Hiram should have 29.
Right. It
So
should be like Brigham and Heber. Yeah.
right,
So,
exactly.
yeah, I'm glad you have that. Like, please, anyone, send in your answers. Like, let us know what this could be, what the cause of this is. Okay.
Right. So the reason five, it's really hard to get pregnant. I've heard this one too, um, particularly if you're a busy person, right? So this is something, again, going back to my situation, because my wife and I have struggled with infertility. We have learned a lot about what it takes to get pregnant. We've learned a lot about the cycles. We learned a lot about the chances of getting pregnant. What are the ideal days to get pregnant? Um, and so we have a lot of sort of anecdotal knowledge because of our personal circumstance that we've been involved in. Um, and eventually we ended up being able to have a family because of in vitro fertilization. But trying all of these sort of rhythm methods and calendar methods, that was sort of our early on attempt to try to get a family. And so we had to learn all this stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so if you are optimal and doing everything that you should do, which it doesn't, the conversely, you might think that you're supposed to have sex a lot during the ovulation window. Actually, you're supposed to kind of skip a few days on the man's part so he can recharge, and and then there's certain days before and certain days after. If you do that
Okay.
just right, you have a 30% chance of getting pregnant. And
Okay.
most
Each
people don't
month.
know
Is
that.
that
That's People think, well, that's pretty low, right? But if you think about it, if you have a 30% chance of getting pregnant in month one,
right?
what's your chance of getting pregnant?
60%.
Right. Well, it's not 60% because, and I'll talk about this in a minute, this has to do with probability math, which
Okay.
I'll get into a little bit, but it goes up, right? It goes up.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you do it, the more, so within a year's time frame, you have a really good chance of getting pregnant. If you are both fertile and you make attempts in the right time of the month, you have a pretty good chance of getting pregnant.
Yeah.
Again, because we
And
don't,
we'll just say, even without the intentional trying, most couples, and like a couple not using birth control is most likely to get pregnant within the first year. And if you haven't gotten pregnant in the first year, even just simply not using birth control or just having a regular sex life, you can be diagnosed with infertility. It's a year that they expect you to get pregnant within. So, okay,
right,
even
right.
not doing everything perfectly.
Right.
Okay.
So let's also imagine, or I guess we don't have to imagine, we know that they didn't really understand this back in 1840.
They didn't understand it at all.
And so it's just going to be a crapshoot. It's out of 31 days of the month. And the only thing that I took out of the equation was, well, there's probably a pretty good chance that they wouldn't be doing it during the times of a period because that's was seen as morally repugnant and theologically repugnant. That wouldn't happen. But if you come from the Sarah Pratt angle of this, you're like, I don't care. I'm a cat and I want to go do what I want to do. The probability of getting pregnant just randomly throughout any day of the month is 3%. Again, that's pretty low.
Okay.
Just random,
Okay.
right? And if you were to take out the days that a woman's on her period, it goes up a little bit. It's 3.3%. So if anybody has that issue or question, there's really not a whole lot of difference. And we're just talking about one time with one person once. during a random time of the month, you have a 3% chance of getting pregnant.
Okay.
So now
And can I add can I just add one little element to this? Often also women's sex drives tend to be higher during fertile periods. And so sex is more likely to occur in a married couple when her sex drive is higher because she's fertile. That's just part of the biological rhythm of things. So anyway, so continue, but I just wanted to add that piece
If you see on my chart here, there's a fertility, there's a bit of a difference between ages. Women are more fertile when they're younger. They're less fertile when they're older. I didn't want to get into all of that, but someone's going to bring that question up. Well, yeah, but of all the women that he could have had children with, how many of them were in their prime?
A lot were. Okay.
But it doesn't make that much of a difference. It makes a difference in like 1 to 1.5%. That's all.
Okay.
Change in the so basically you have a 3% chance of getting pregnant. Maybe take off 0.1, 0.2% on that, and that's the difference. That's a differential. That doesn't change.
Okay.
It. Okay.
Great.
So, oops. So I went ahead and made a chart of a number of possible sexual encounters, and I only included 18 wives. Okay. So Brian Hell says there's 10. I counted 18 that I considered to be viable. That's my number. But really, I just ran out of space. I just chopped it off.
Okay.
So down the left-hand side, you have the number of wives, and across the upper side are the number of encounters with those wives. And so
I just want to clarify when Brian Hill says 10, he says 10 that we have strong evidence of sexuality. Todd Compton assumes that a wife means sex. So really, this number could be much higher. You could have gone up to 33 wives, which is the smaller estimate of how many wives Joseph had. You could have gone up to 50. So you're being quite conservative here by only including 18 wives. I just want to point that out.
And by the way, that number 432 that I've got circled, if Joseph's polygamy calendar is 2 years, which is about 2 years, from the middle of 42 to the middle of 44.
The super high intensity polygamy.
If he was having conjugal relations every other day, he would have had 432 encounters. So that's kind of the maximum I think of that's possible. I guess you could say he had it every day, but I don't know.
That's also only within those 2 years, right?
Correct.
And I know that a lot of I guess we can call them polygamous men who have a lot of sexual opportunity might have sex more than once a day, right? It's not so if he were really running this polygamous cult. So I don't want to even necessarily say that's the maximum, because you only have 2 years, you only have 18 wives, and you're only saying every other day. So it is a high-end estimate based on the every other day, but there are other reasons that would make it rather low-end. So,
This is what I call a conservative maximum estimate.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about probability, because I have some training in it. You know, I went to get economics degree and studied statistics in my master's program, and know how to model it just a little bit. So it's helpful for people to think about this in terms of like a 12-sided dice, or a 12-sided die or die. Dice is 1, die is 2. You take that 12-sided die and you roll it, and you go, what is the chance of you rolling a 1? It's 1 in 12 chances, which is about 3%. Now roll it again. Now roll it again. What's the chance of getting 1? Same probability. However, what's the chance of you rolling a 1 either once or twice? You don't add it together. You don't multiply it together. It's a complicated mathematical analysis, but essentially it's higher. We'll just put it that way. Now, if you roll a die 100 times, what are the chances of you getting a 1 at least once of those times? It's basically
very
100%
high
chance you're going to get 1 at least once. So that's what we're trying to figure out here is, what's the probability of having at least 1 child in all of these circumstances?
Okay.
So that you understand where we're coming from here. So let's go to
Okay,
the
so
next
you're
chart.
saying even if we roll the die 432 times, we're going to get a 1 at least
Yeah,
once. Okay.
correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yep, at least once. So I plugged this into a probability matrix, and the colors on here really help. So you notice at that very, very far end of 432, you're deep into 100% chance. But that doesn't really tell the full picture. It's probably more like 1,000% chance, if that makes sense.
Okay.
You're going to roll a one more than once, probably, and we'll show that a little bit later, probably closer to between 7 and 20 times using the probabilities that we have here. And then you have a little bit of a lighter shade of green, and that's the 90th percentile. And then you have another light band that's the 80th percentile, and then the 70 and the 60, and then the white is anything under 50%. And so just as an example, if Joseph was only married to one wife and has 20 encounters with that one wife, by the
over those 2 years?
Over those 2 years, by the 21st encounter, and it could be over any period of time. We're just talking about encounters, right? By the 21st time, he's now at a 50% chance of getting pregnant. Okay. So, and usually you're talking about it in terms of a month because cycles go in a month, and that's a really good estimate. As you'll see in a minute, why I kind of picked a monthly sort of assumption is because of the way the cycles work. So we're now 50% at 2 wives. At 2 wives and 10 encounters, you have to multiply those encounters. So it's not like it's like 10 encounters with one wife and 10 encounters with the second wife. Then you start to hit the green once you do that, and then the more wives you go up, the faster you hit the green. So that by the time you're at 11 wives, if you just have 2 encounters with each one of those 11 wives, you're now at 50% chance of getting pregnant. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? I mean, it's just really kind of an interesting way to sort of like.
It's really, I do want to again point out that you stopped the graph at 18. And according to some people, it could go all the way to 50, at least to 33. So by the time you get down into those numbers, that dark green section would be huge. And I just want to say, like 90%. Does anyone want to take a bet that's against 90%? Right? That's a very, very high probability. Okay. Even if we're not in the 100% range.
Right.
So
So now we want to plug in what our experts say about Joseph's conjugality. So we'll go to our 3 experts here, Brian Hales, Todd Compton, and Fawn Brody. And we're going to steel man it just a little bit to try to help them out, but then we'll see what happens. One of the things that I've got to point out is I'm putting an assumption in here that you have 1 sexual encounter a month for a year, just 1 year, with each
and just one encounter a month. That's not much.
With each one of these wives. Okay, that's not a lot. And I plug that into my graph, and I go, okay, Brian Hales, you say that there's 10 wives that we have good evidence.
There's evidence.
And if you just have 1 relationship with one of those wives for a whole year, once a month, you have a 98.3% chance.
Wow. Okay.
And that's just 1 year. If it's 2 years,
and just 1 wife.
Yeah, if it's 2 years, it's a 100% chance. If you go down to once every other month or bi-monthly, it's 86.9%. So
in 1 year.
High.
Okay.
It's still a high percentage. It's
still going to happen. It's still going to happen with one of these women.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you go for 2 years, it's 100%. And that's with just 10 wives.
Right.
So now if you throw Fawn Brody and Compton in there, the chances are you're 100%. You basically lock yourself down. And here's the crazy conclusion we come to is the more wives that we give Joseph Smith, the worse the case gets that he as to why he doesn't have any children.
Right.
If you'd only had 4 wives,
Right.
you could make the claim with 4 wives, because you go look at that chart and go, well, 4 wives, and maybe he wasn't very busy. Maybe that's why we don't have very many children. And the interesting thing is, if you take that graph and you apply it to some of these other men that have 5 wives,
Yeah.
4 wives, 3 wives, the numbers kind of pan out a little bit.
Okay.
They kind of work.
That's
You
so
look at it and
interesting.
go, okay, we got 1 or 2 kids out of this. Well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so anyway, that's where we're at. And to Brian Hale's credit, and to the apologist's credit, I feel like that they have you said this, but I'll reiterate, they have the weakest case when it comes to trying to justify Mormon polygamy and the morality of Joseph Smith. They do all kinds of cartwheels to try to make that work, and it's really disingenuous and difficult to swallow. Even when I was on my mission, and even when I was
Believing the standard narrative.
believing in the standard narrative, it just couldn't swallow it really easily. I just had to put it on the shelf. But
Right. But I think you. Oh, go ahead.
In this instance, he has the stronger argument, because at least with his argument, we're into some plausible, probabilities that actually could work in a slim chance.
He's at least on the right. He's at least on the side of minimizing the sex, saying there really wasn't very much sex at all.
Minimize
the other
sex,
side,
you're going to have a better chance of overcoming the no children argument. Bottom line.
Not a good one. It's not good, but it's better.
Not great.
Okay.
It's not great,
but it's not as bad as the side that has always made it about. That's
better than the Fawn Brody, Todd Compton, Lindsay Park sort of take.
Yeah. Okay.
But let's take us a step further, because one of the reasons they talk about is that Joseph didn't have access to, or he was busy, or couldn't get around, and that's why, if there was, you could say that it was really difficult for him to find time to put it in his calendar to meet up with these women. I've heard that too. Until you look at the reality of the situation, is that he's got 7 women living under his roof at certain points of time in his life that he would have had easy access to any given night. Get up 2 o'clock in the morning, walk
or day,
hall,
or anywhere. Yep.
And so that argument just doesn't wash, because you've got Fanny Alger, who's the first one we claim is a wife. And I'm assuming a 2-year residency. I actually couldn't find how long she actually lived with them. It was at least 2 years, is my understanding.
Okay.
And the marriage date, I just made an assumption that she was married for 1 year. If you are in the apologist camp, you're going to say that sex didn't happen until the marriage date. If you're in the ex-Mormon camp, you're going to say the sex happened immediately. The marriage was only a cover story, right?
Right. Well, and I guess that's a good point. Like the story in the barn, if you're going to believe that they were like having sex in the barn, which I think is there's not good evidence for that at all. But if you're going to believe that, why would you assume that was the first time they were having sex? It would have just been the one time Emma caught them. So it would be the last time, not the first time. So yes, they could have been having sex many, many, many other times before they got caught, as often happens in affairs. So, okay.
Right. And so I just went through and pointed out that Emily Partridge had an 11-month residency, from my estimates, and was 4 months married to Joseph Smith before she was, kicked out of the homestead. And
she would have gotten pregnant.
Eliza
she was very
Partridge
fertile. Anyway.
had 5 months of married time and 11 months residency. Not Lucy Walker. I don't know the residency, but she was 3 months married to him. But I know she was living under the roof as a nanny while she was there. And then we have the mysterious Sarah and Maria Lawrence, who lived with them for 4 years, basically, were taken into the Smith household essentially as foster daughters, and then married in the middle of 1843 as sort of Emma doesn't like the Partridge sisters, but she's okay with the Lawrence sisters. Maria died, I think, before coming west. We don't have any good statements from her. We have other people that say, yeah, Sarah was a wife of Joseph Smith. Maria was the wife of Joseph Smith, but Sarah Lawrence gets out to Utah, by the way. I just found this out. Isn't this fascinating, the things that you find out just by going to do some research on these wives? Is that Sarah claimed she was never with Joseph Smith. She was never married to Joseph Smith. She's one wife out there that says bull honky to it all. Nobody ever talks
And
about that one.
she's still considered a wife, even though she herself said absolutely not.
Correct.
And her dead sister is also a wife. Oh my word.
And that
Okay.
came from Brian Hill's website. So
Oh my
he
word.
points it out and just
Okay.
kind of buries the lead. But I mean, that's a
Yeah.
huge like I guess
So even the women,
now you can say that
even the,
Joseph had two wives that basically lied about him having wives, Emma Smith and Sarah Lawrence.
oh my word. Okay. All right.
And then you've got
That's
Melissa Lott.
amazing.
She was the last one, the tail end. She got married to him when they were in the Nauvoo mansion house in September, October, and essentially stays until he's martyred. Again, she's there for 10 months. And she's one of the
So
ones.
all of these women.
And Melissa and Eliza went on record at the Temple Lot case and said they were basically husband and wife.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And these women were all young, prime fertility years. And I can't speak authoritatively because I don't know off the top of my head about all of them, but my understanding is at least the vast majority, if not all of them, went on to have children without any problem. They weren't, nobody in this story was facing fertility issues.
correct.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't looked at all of them, but the vast majority of
Right.
them later on. Okay.
I can do that research and correct it if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Okay.
So if we plug in a more realistic encounter scenario with these women, 7 women, if Joseph just went down the hall once a week, we're at 100% chance.
Right.
If he went down the hall
Twice a month.
we're 100% chance. If he only went down the hall once a month, we're still at a 96.1% chance of having at least one child from one of
And
these.
why would he go down the hall only once a month if this were the reality of the situation? Oh my goodness. Okay.
So the question we have to ask ourselves is, if we believe what these women say, the children argument sort of undercuts their testimony. But if we don't believe what they say and we believe they exaggerated, well, what else do they exaggerate about? So you're kind of putting a conundrum here.
Okay, so you're saying whether we believe them about the sexual encounters.
Correct.
They're in a lose-lose situation. The accusers of Joseph have a lose-lose situation. Okay, excellent.
Right. Correct. And that's what's challenging about this whole argument. So, and then finally, I applied these child ratios from other polygamists with Nauvoo children.
Okay.
And I just pulled 5 out. I could have done more, but I went ahead and pulled 5 out, and we have an average fertility rate of 86%. In other words, for almost one polygamist wife, you have an 80th. It's like almost the chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For every wife, you have 0.86 of a child. So
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right.
So if you then put Joseph Smith back into the mix, we should find between 9 and 26 children of Joseph Smith somewhere in Nauvoo.
Wow. Wow, based on that same fertility rate that stands up with all of the others.
Correct. And we don't.
That's amazing.
And that's just hard fact is that we don't. And so again, one of these ducks quacks differently than the other duck. And so can we really say that they're all doing the same thing? And the answer is
right.
No. All right, so we got through that. We have 2 more answers to go through. This last second to last one's kind of silly. But I looked into it a little bit. So Michael Quinn comes up with this argument that Joseph Smith was super interested in the astrological side of things. He had the Jupiter talisman. He was big into scrying, and he and Hiram were big into gold digging and seer stoning and using magic techniques. He wrote the book, Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. And because Joseph's children were largely born in the spring or the fall, he proposes that Joseph either believed or conjured or did some sort of like ceremony or had some sort of fertility god capability of only siring children when he wanted to sire children.
Right.
This argument
And
came
it's
up on,
goofy.
a very sciencey, sort of explanation as to why Joseph Smith didn't have children but was still a polygamist. This popped up as one of the reasons that was given, and I thought that was very interesting that this would become an argument that someone would take even remotely seriously, given the fact that they believed that Joseph Smith was a con man and didn't have any magical power at all to translate records, but he has the ability to wave a magic wand and decide when he's going to conceive children. And then the last one is, I've heard from especially polygamists themselves say that, look, polygamy fertility was low. And so I started looking into this, and they based that primarily off of the fact that in Utah, polygamy fertility was generally lower. But this is just comparing numbers. It's just looking at numbers of children born to numbers of wives in polygamous households versus numbers of children born to numbers of wives in monogamous households. And so,
right. And
while it's true, there's
go ahead.
Yeah. Scientific study. It's just a raw comparison.
Right. I think it's also useful to just consider how this argument shoots them in the foot as well, because the claim is that God needs polygamy so more babies could be born, and yet polygamous women in Utah had fewer babies. And maybe you're going to get to this, but I think it had much more to do with the circumstances. You had men of multiple wives sent on missions for years at a time, or traveling long distances in frontier Utah to get to each of the wives. The women had far fewer children because they had far fewer opportunities to have children because they effectively didn't have a husband for most of the time. Right. So it's circumstantial, not in any way scientific or okay.
So some of the other arguments they make is there's a sexual selection bias, which essentially means that a man gets to choose his mate, but a woman doesn't really get to choose hers. So subconsciously, she's going to be less fertile because she didn't optimize her selectivity. Very Darwinistic way to look at marriage. But
also shoots polygamy in the foot because it's saying women are miserable in polygamy, which is true, but that's a pretty funny way to talk about it. Okay.
So then there's male fertility, and they'll say, well, there's lower fertility because men are having so much sex, they're essentially depleted.
Their sperm counts are lower because they don't have as much time to recharge, is what they're saying.
Correct. Okay. And then the other one was that the cohabitating women or women under the same households would have aligning menstrual cycles, and therefore they're all pretty much only fertile at a certain time of the month and not certain at the other times of the month. So that's going to change fertility rates. So those are all the reasons that were given. But thankfully, we have some science to back us up. They actually, because places in West Africa still practice polygamy today, they did a huge fertility study down there where they baked in all these other factors, right? And they baked in all these factors, and at the end of the day, there's no difference. So we've really addressed all these reasons that people give us to why Joseph Smith didn't have polygamy.
Yeah, I do want to point out really quickly just on this last slide, because you mentioned women's periods aligning, and I pointed out in the last episode that actually doesn't happen. That's been proven to be false anyway. So
what is?
And that women's periods, that women's cycles align when they live together.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's been proven false. Also, Joseph's wives didn't live together, right?
Well,
his
other than
supposed
the ones
wives,
under the same roof, right?
In his right, and that would be irrelevant because that doesn't even happen. So okay.
Right. So, but the point is, at the end of the day, the scientific study took all those things and factored them out. And at the end of the day, they said, look, there's polygamy and monogamy fertility. So this is a non-issue.
Okay.
All right. So the final answer is that Joseph wasn't a polygamist. And for me, it's the most rational expectation based on the physical evidence and the numbers. And it's true that there's a lot of testimonial evidence that seems to say the other way is more likely. But if you're trying to compare physical evidence to testimonial evidence, physical evidence is almost always stronger because
It wins. Yeah.
it's kind of like if you're trying to, there's the old adage that if you're trying to find, you're trying to figure out a murder case, in order to convict a murderer, you have to have a body, a murder
And a
weapon, and a
weapon.
motive.
Hmm.
And in this case, we don't have bodies, we don't have murder weapons. We may have a motive, but that's it. It's very light to go on. And so, in order to,
Well, we
have some,
could, the physical evidence would be the bodies of the children. We should have the bodies, right? The smoking gun would be things in the journals, in the letters, and that, like, there is physical evidence we could have. And interestingly, we do have that on the other side. We have the history, we have the massively strong motive on the other side, and we have all of the physical evidence of the literally changed documents, changed records, changed journal entries. And we have the earlier letters and journal entries of the polygamists that were practicing it before Joseph taught it to them. And then we have all of the children of the polygamists. So I would say that we have a massive amount of physical evidence to, like you said, to contrast these two, well, the polygamists from Joseph Smith. And then all we have is that testimonial evidence, which all of it was massively motivated, and there's no physical evidence to back it up. So it falls very, very flat.
Right.
So if we're going to look at Occam's razor, like the idea that the answer is the one that requires the least amount of speculation and the least amount of coming up with various scenarios, the obvious answer that fits Occam's razor, that requires the least amount of speculation or wild Jupiter and Saturn type answers, is that Joseph was not a polygamist.
right.
That's
I just want to say that's for you, Bill Real. I'm not trying to be mean, but you're the one that points out that we have to find the most rational explanation, the Occam's razor, with the least amount of conjecture. If you come at it from the physical evidence side, that's the most rational explanation. And
right. You don't have to worry about being mean because he won't watch this because he doesn't watch any of the information.
So then if people take issue with the fact that we're looking at other ways to construct the testimonial evidence that seems conspiratorial, this is why. Because we have to find a way that makes the testimonial evidence fit the physical evidence. And really, that's the end of the presentation. We can't plow around this fact. We can't gloss over it. We can't just point out at the end of very long presentations that go through, Melissa Law and Lucy Blocker and Helen Mar Kimball, and you can go through millions of pages of affidavits, but if you can't attack this head on and just discuss it as an aside, you're not being honest with the evidence.
Right. And you know what's interesting? Just like you pointed out, that amazing piece, that we even either ignore or change the actual testimonial evidence, because Sarah, who said that she and her sister were not, whose sister was dead, and she said she wasn't married to Joseph, we ignore that because it doesn't go along. So all we are basing this case on is the friendly testimonial evidence, the testimonial evidence that supports our case. Right. So Peter, this was awesome. I hope people found it compelling. I certainly did. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we wrap it up?
No, this is it. There's a big, massive oak tree that you've got to deal with if you want to solve this case. If you want to, if you want to help us come to terms with your conclusions, you've got to come at this head on. And please, hopefully as we've gone through this, you'll understand that it's really offensive when you call people conspiracy theorists and polygamy deniers, when we're just looking at the hard physical evidence here and we're coming to these conclusions based upon numbers and what we see as lack of physical evidence.
Absolutely. That's so funny. It just shows that they can't deal with the issues, because every single one of us, at least that I'm aware of, believed Joseph was a polygamist. That's what we were taught. That's what we believed. And it wasn't until we saw this kind of evidence that the evidence changed our mind. So I invite other people to consider the evidence, and the evidence should have an impact on your conclusions if you're an honest actor. So thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate it. Good luck with your baby and wish your wife the very best. I'm so glad that you got him here and got him home. I love how clearly and succinctly Peter stated that conclusion, and I think he is exactly right. Again, critical thinking requires you to take the most obvious answer that requires the least amount of conjecture and speculation and the least amount of twisting of and ignoring facts. So I invite anybody who disagrees with this to please respond. Let's keep the conversation going. But I think that the case is quite clear. We will still continue to go forward and get into the other claims that the other side uses and relies on to insist that Joseph was a polygamist, despite this overwhelming body of hard physical evidence that I think simply cannot be overcome. So thank you for being here for this episode, and please stay tuned. Much, much more to come.